Ladies and gentlemen of Forestry 584, my name is John Maxwell and my presentation is on the legislative history and background of the Clean Air Act and updates. The first federal legislation involving air pollution was the Air Pollution Control Act of 1955. It was followed by the more substantial Clean Air Act of 1963. This act dealt with reducing air pollution by setting emission standards for stationary sources, such as power plants and steel mills. It did not account for mobile sources of pollution. Emission standards on automobiles began with the Motor Vehicle Air Pollution Act of 1965. The Clean Air Act of 1970 is the most significant of all the air pollution legislation. It created comprehensive regulations, such as the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, as well as avenues for enforcement and compliance. The Clean Air Act of 1990 set forth measures to deal with environmental issues like acid rain, toxic pollutants, and ozone depletion. The Acts of 1963 and 1970 are particularly important. The Clean Air Act of 1963 laid the conceptual framework for all future air quality legislation. The Act dealt with researching the sources of air pollution and the processes for addressing the problem. The 1970 Act became one of the world's most comprehensive air quality laws. The creation of the EPA in that same year ushered in a new age of application. The establishment of NAAQS was a significant moment in air quality legislation. The Clean Air Act of 1963 began with executive pressure from President Kennedy and continued after his assassination. In April of that same year, the Senate created a subcommittee on air and water pollution. The Clean Air Act was signed in December of 1963 with comfortable margins of support from an 88th Congress that held a liberal majority in both houses of Congress. 1970 marked a year of extensive environmental legislation. The Clean Air Act of 1970 enjoyed bilateral support due to the emergence of air quality as a national issue that year in particular. Senator Gaylord Nelson sponsored the first Earth Day in April of that year, and the vice presidential nominee in 1968, Senator Edmund Muskie, was the primary sponsor of the bill. President Nixon signed the bill into law 31 December of 1970. Several presidents and Congresses have been involved in the clean air legislation over the years. The following sources were used in the development of my presentation.